two topics that aren't normally put side by side in a presentation or in writing. And I really wasn't going to dwell on it very much until I started thinking more about it a couple weeks ago in preparation for this. And I started thinking of all kinds of connections. So I'm going to spend a few minutes first talking about those. And then a little more generally about critical thinking and what that means and how important it is in these kinds of areas. And then I'm going to, I'm having a little lingering cold issue, so forgive my voice, but I'm going to talk about astrology a little more specifically. I can go into more depth if you ask questions about it and so forth. I'm not an astrologer, I'm not a big expert on astrology, but my focus has been more on the kind of research that's been done to test the claims of astrology. And in that context, I know some things about it. I couldn't name the 12 signs or anything like that, but I can tell you about the research if you're interested. So first, I'm not going to talk generally about religion, but I will say a few things about Christianity. In particular, again, this is the part I started thinking about a couple weeks ago, how are the two of these areas connected? And it was sort of irresistible seeing all of these parallels. And you know, the human mind is a kind of creative thing, and you start to see correspondences, just like astrologers see correspondences. So when I started thinking about astrology and religion, I came up with a series of these connect the dots kinds of things. Both of them are highly popular belief systems. Something in the order of 80 or 85% of people in our country subscribe to religious beliefs, and depending on the poll, 25 to 40% of adults in the U.S. believe in astrology, believe that there are astrological forces governing our lives. Both of them have origins around the same time in history. Astrology, some of the ideas in astrology go way back, 3,500, 4,000 years ago, but the system that we see today, I think it emerged out of Babylonia, and then the Greeks attributed a lot of the properties to the different astrological signs about 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. So similar time frames. Interestingly, both religion and astrology have subsets of people who approach it in a scientific way. So we have creation science or intelligent design theory in Christianity, and we have the majority of astrologers believing that astrology is a science, and in fact they call it the oldest science.
And in the Dover trial for intelligent design, Michael Behe tried to present his view of what science should be considered. And it's like, okay, so if that's your definition for science, wouldn't astrology also fall into that? And he had eventually, after hemming and hawing, had to say, yeah, I would.
He's talking about the Nova documentary on intelligent design on trial, I think it was called. Fantastic documentary. Yeah, that was a wonderful moment, too. Neither religion nor astrology seems to really care about disproof. They both they each in their own ways just continue. They persist no matter what the evidence seems to be against them.
Can't you attribute that to many scientists too?
Oh yeah, but not science per se.
Yeah. Well, that's what the whole peer review process is for. So.
Yeah. Science does progress. Astrology is still the same.
Not easily.
No. But that's a whole other issue, but it does. There are also disagreements on fundamental issues. So scientists tend to agree on fundamentals of science, the nature of science, and the importance of testing, and so on. Within astrology, there are astrologers who believe that it's not even science, it's an art form, or it's a practice. And certainly within religion, Christianity even, every offshoot of Christianity that you see is the result of some kind of fundamental disagreement. I was showing students a video about the Amish, and I didn't realize this. The Amish have all kinds of splinter groups. Even within like Lancaster County, each district which is associated with a church has its own set of beliefs. Now there are some core beliefs that are shared, but there are others involving whether you have double suspenders or one suspender in the back, that these are really, really important issues to them. They disagree on them, and then they form splinter groups. So maybe more importantly, both of these areas make people feel, astrology and Christianity make people feel connected to something greater, something bigger than themselves. And each of them invoke a kind of mysterious force, and astrologers are pretty happy to say we don't always know why it works. We may never know why it works. We just know that it works. And religion, I mean, you have a lot of proponents of religion who do claim to understand the mind of God, but most don't. I mean, most do treat God as working in mysterious ways. My clicker works in mysterious ways too. And this is an interesting one. I did a project with a student one time who claimed her mother was like really into astrology and did charts for people and so on. And Rose was actually the subject of this, where Rose filled out a personality trait inventory, and based only on her, and we peppered it with ones that were her own and others that weren't hers, based only on her birthday, her astrological information. The mother was supposed to determine which traits actually applied to her and which traits didn't. And before she ever got around to doing that, she said, well, if I'm wrong about any of those, it's because she doesn't know herself. Oh. It's not that astrology is wrong. So again, the test stopped at that point. There's no point in continuing. And of course, God knows your heart better than you do.
That's right.
Let me try to step you over. Both of them are social phenomena as well. People don't learn about and practice astrology in isolation. In fact, most people who are really into astrology are into counseling astrology, where they go to counselors or they become counselors and work one-on-one with people. And the dynamics of that are really interesting from a social psychological standpoint. But the interesting thing about both astrology and religion, religious belief, is that when you have enough people who are surrounding you and agreeing with or believing in something that in any other context would make no sense at all, it becomes reasonable. You embed yourself in a subculture, and the subcultural beliefs just seem sensible to you. Another function that both of them seem to allow us a kind of sense of control over things that are really pretty uncontrollable. Both of them deal with very, very vast kinds of phenomena, and also both of them deal with you as a person, your everyday life and your personal characteristics. And approaching the end of my list here. Interestingly, there are some direct connections I found between astrology and Christianity. A subset of astrologers believe that the Bible justifies astrology. They have to look at it a little selectively and interpretively, but Jeremiah 10:2, do not be terrified by signs in the sky. Daniel 4:26, your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. And some astrologers take this as validation for the Bible. Now, there are other parts of the Bible that say astrology is a horrible thing. I mean, it's direct contradiction to these beliefs, but if you read the Bible, you kind of...
They don't quote those.
No, they don't quote those. You get to cherry pick.
Yeah.
And I found that when I laid these all out, and this is... So I know I knew I was onto something. It came out like that. All right, moving on. Critical thinking. This is a nice handy little definition of what critical thinking is, as far as I'm concerned.
I can't see it. So
Rational and objective cognitive methods for evaluating claims. In other words, these are really psychological tools that we apply. It doesn't mean that they exist only in your head, though. To apply critical thinking, you do need to know a few things. Surprisingly, not too many. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to apply critical thinking, obviously. But you do need more than just a feeling of skepticism, which is what most people who are skeptical of astrology will say. It just doesn't make sense to me, but not really knowing why. So we're gonna look at 3 important facets of critical thinking. One of them is having relevant information. So if we're going to be critical about astrology or about religion, you need to actually know something about what they're claiming, how they explain things, what they're using as evidence, and whether it's valid evidence and reliable evidence. And in science, that means reliability means you can repeat the test or the observation. And validity means that you're actually observing what you think you're observing. You're not. A reliable and valid survey would be one that if you applied it multiple times, you get the same array of responses. And people are responding to the same question that you think you're asking. They're not misinterpreting. That would be the validity part of it. Also, have you looked at alternative explanations for the phenomenon? And are you cherry picking? Are you ignoring evidence that would go against your belief? Another facet is logical fallacies, and these are everywhere in astrology, not to mention religious belief as well. Doesn't mean astrology is wrong, it doesn't mean religion is wrong. It just means these are not valid bases for arguing against them, or arguing for them, rather. And I'm going to go into each of these in a moment, so don't worry about the specifics there. That third facet, which I'm not going to be able to get into, this is really my interest area, but I like to talk about things that aren't in my wheelhouse sometimes, why we believe in things that aren't true. And part of this has to do with our perceptual abilities, our perceptual apparatus. Part of it has to do with what we do with the perceptions, how we filter those perceptions and make judgments on the basis of them. And a big part of it has to do with social influences, what other people are telling us that they see, what they believe, especially when we're children growing up. So let's start with this, the relevant information part of this. What are the claims of astrology? The basic claim we all know, that the positions of stars and planets at the moment of our birth determine all kinds of things about us for the rest of our lives. It's a big, bold claim. Some of the things that they claim are affected by the planets and stars. Physical traits, health status, personality characteristics, that's maybe the most popular. Close relationships, whether you will succeed or fail in a relationship based on the compatibility of your signs. Job opportunities, and in general, your life chances, even how long you will live. Also, one of the things you don't hear about that much is that astrologers claim to be able to predict current events, things in the world. Ronald Reagan employed an astrologer to help him make decisions about what he was, about policy.
Wasn't that his wife?
She went to psychics. I don't know if she went to astrologers too, but he did.
He did.
He did, yeah. Famously. There are also claims that astrologers make about astrology. I mentioned they claim it's the oldest science. That sort of begs the question of whether it's a science at all, which it isn't. I mean, there's no other science has remained unchanged for 2,000 years, for starters, but there are a lot of other issues. I'll touch on a couple of those. Astronomy was an offshoot of astrology. Actually, there is a little bit of truth to that. I mean, there are people who as science developed around the time of Newton and observational, actually Galileo was the first to be able to observe the planets and stars with a telescope. But that scientific thinking most of these people did start with beliefs in astrology until theories of astronomy started to emerge. Based on thousands of years of observation, well, that's loosely true. They do observe planets and stars, but it's what you do with those observations that make it scientific or not. And it's believed by millions, absolutely true, in this country alone and worldwide. What are the explanations? And this is where you start to get into the pseudoscience, because the explanations that are offered are bad explanations by any scientific standard. And a lot of metaphors are used, a lot of hand-waving. But gravity, so we're affected by the gravity of the stars and the planets. And the argument is, well, we know gravity exists. That's scientifically proven. We are objects. Are we not affected by the gravitational forces of other objects? I mean, look at the tides, which is a particular kind of gravitational force. We are water. I mean, we're mostly water, so shouldn't we be affected by the movements of the planets and stars? And yes, we are, but to such a minuscule extent. Gravity and tidal forces operate on large objects, not so much on little tiny objects like us. And it turns out that a mosquito landing on you has more of a gravitational tug on you than Mars does. The person standing next to your mother at the moment of your birth has thousands of times more of a tidal force on you than any planet or stars. So if those were the mechanisms by which astrology is working, you'd have to take into account who's in the room when you're born, as well as a lot of other things. Mosquitoes, I guess. Magnetic fields, well, some planets have magnetic fields and others don't, so that's a ridiculous explanation, because all the planets affect you astrologically. Particle emissions, well, stars emit particles, but planets don't. Electromagnetism, I don't even know how that's supposed to work. Again, no mechanism is offered. It's just, it's electromagnetism. That's the explanation. And planetary vibrations. Again, the idea is that planets give off some sort of vibration that we have never measured, but which is what's making astrological forces work. There's more. There's many more of these explanations.
I'm glad you mentioned. I have wondered if there's a biological kernel of truth in the personality variation, simply because the development of the brain in a fetus is sensitive to the mother's personal chemistry. So if the mother has scurvy or rickets during a critical phase of brain development in the winter, which back in the old days that was very common, would the child's brain growth be ever so slightly different and come with the character? So would children who were who were born during the summer have subtly different personalities than children who were born during the winter?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of seasonal effects involving biological development or physiological development and those sorts of things. But you just offered a mechanism for how that might work.
Yeah.
They don't offer any such mechanism.
There are cultural ones too, like how you get seated in the classroom or how you get set into a class by when your birthday happens to fall.
Yeah.
Things like that can affect you just your whole life.
The Freakonomics argument about what time in the year you were born, whether you're slightly more mature or less mature when you start school, for instance, has a huge effect on your outcomes. They talked about NHL players are almost all born within this 3 or 4 month period because they were bigger when they started playing hockey with kids there in their age group. And that gave them advantages that the other kids didn't have. But anyway, none of that's obviously what astrology is talking about. Astrology is talking about forces that are emanating from the stars and the planets and working on us in an unknown but very, very profound way. Those are testable claims. That's important to keep in mind. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible. There may be a mechanism, but they're not telling us. And as a science, they're responsible for explaining this. Explaining it better than just saying it's the electromagnetic forces.
Excuse me, I think as those of us who follow the scientific method, I think it's much more interesting to wonder if people who developed these original precepts were more scientific than their latter-day followers, and what might have made them think when
The originators of astrology?
Yes. I think they have had a more scientific approach than the latter people.
Well, they are doing something that most others didn't at the time, which was at least they were attributing these phenomena to the material world or the material universe, and not saying it was magic or godlike forces or something like that. And at the time astrology developed, it was as scientific as anything else, certainly. But what qualifies something as a science is what it then does, what it does with the knowledge it has on hand, and how it develops it from that point. So rather than trying to preserve the original claims in the science, you would try to falsify those claims. You would try to beat on them until they submit, and then.
Sounds like too many scientists I know.
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't maybe use violent language, but you do try to subject claims in any real science to the strictest possible tests, and that's just something that's not done. Now, individually, as someone mentioned before, scientists don't always act that way. Scientists are conservative in the sense that they try to preserve what they already believe to be true. But as a discipline, it has mechanisms for self-correcting that individuals don't have. And astrology has not any of those mechanisms for self-correction. There are no really scientific astrologers who are submitting these claims to tests and trying to improve the claims as a result of those tests. That's what I'm getting into a little bit here. The kind of evidence they offer instead is that lots of people believe it. It feels right. I know from the evidence of my own senses, I know astrology works. And one of my best friends is totally into astrology, and that's her evidence. It's good enough for me. And subjective validation is the cherry-picking idea that we look for cases where the horoscope seems to fit the events of the day, and we ignore all the times that it's wrong. So we only validate based on what we observe to be correct and not what we observe to be incorrect.
Question?
Yes.
Believed by many. Now, I know what my astrological sign is. Am I considered a believer? Or how do you define believers?
For me, I would define that it's if not only do you think that the claims that it's making are valid, but you're willing to go so far as to change your behavior as a result of your horoscope, let's say.
Well, another part of that is if you are told you're this sign and these are the attributes to your sign, you might take them on.
Well, that's one of the tests I was going to talk about too. Yeah. One of the bad tests, actually. So as far as the kind of reliable and valid evidence, there have actually been hundreds of tests of astrological claims. None of them have supported in the most robust way. I mean, you would think that people born under a Mars sign would be more aggressive. People born under a more peaceful sign would be more peaceful. None of that stuff has worked. Not personalities, not relationships, none of the things I listed earlier have actually worked in empirical tests. The evidence that astrologers like to bring up from empirical testing was a study done many, many years ago, I think over 100 years ago, and which has since been discredited completely and not replicated. I mean, no one can replicate it. There are all kinds of methodological problems with it. To bring that out as the best evidence for astrology is really sad and indicative of the problem with the field. If we have a chance, I'll mention the Sean Carlson study, which was just so definitive. He tested astrologers. They developed the test protocol together. The astrologers had a very low bar for what would count as success. It had to do with being able to choose the horoscope of a person whose personality was independently measured with the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. So the astrologers accepted that this was a valid personality measure. Their astrological charts and readings should be able to match up with a person's personality as measured independently, and their results were exactly a chance. But if we have time, I'll tell you the methodology a little more. The evidence against is more than you know. I mean, it's more than just these studies. It's that if astrology were true, it would violate laws of physics that otherwise have not been violated. It would go against what we know about the impact of genetics on our physiologies and our life chances. Neuroscience and psychology and sociology, and also, as I mentioned, lots of actual empirical tests. So for astrology to be right, it has a huge mountain to climb, and it just hasn't even started. And just as one example of the kind of logical issue that defeats it, astrological forces travel across galaxies to impact us, alter the course of societies, determine the lives of countless individuals, but they don't start acting on you until you're born. There's something about the mother's abdominal wall, apparently, that stops all of those forces, right? And not until you actually emerge do you get imprinted with the astrological forces. So it just doesn't make sense. And then what about, like, cesarean section? Would it be the real birthday that counts, or when you're actually taken out of the womb? Or is it when the head emerges? Or when the whole body? There's so many questions.
Well, I think it's like, it's always been really ironic that, you know, how they have one of the signs, Gemini, that's a pair of twins, but they don't see that, like, twins having very different lives itself refutes the idea the day you're born. And it's like, how do you not see that?
So whenever you're criticizing something like this, you say, what are the alternative explanations? Normally that means there's some phenomenon that's unexplained. But if astrological predictions aren't even working, then there's no alternative explanations needed. Right? But what is interesting to try to explain is why so many people believe in it. And just, I'm only going to touch on this superficially, but this is one of the areas I'm really interested in. When you're not using some kind of critical thinking as a basis of your belief, that leaves you open to other kinds of ways of understanding things that are likely to deceive or distract you. Magical thinking is one of the more popular ways of characterizing that. The law of similarities is the idea that we draw correspondences between things based on their apparent similarity, and then we start to attribute properties that aren't necessarily connected, that aren't necessarily part of this. So with astrology, it started by people observing constellations around the horizon. Those constellations are just patterns of stars, which could be interpreted many different ways. But they were interpreted by culturally specific ways by particular people at particular times in history. And then not only that, but they attributed, so I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, I think, but they attributed, if they see a ram, they attribute the characteristics of the ram to that constellation. And if you're born while the sun is rising in that constellation, you will have the characteristics of a ram. That's how astrology works. And ironically, there's no ram up there, right? The constellation is an interpretation. Like if you're standing at a different place in the solar system or in the galaxy, those stars are going to form a completely different pattern. So there's no ram up there to begin with. And yet that becomes, through this law of similars, that becomes the basis for all the attributes that are associated astrologically with your birthday.
Well,
I'm going to come back to the logical fallacies here, just briefly. Argument from antiquity is used all the time with astrology and Chinese medicine and a lot of other things. It's been around for a long time, therefore it must be valid. But we know that's not true. People who believe in astrology find that compelling, but scientifically, no. You need evidence, you need logic. Argument from authority. So you're supposed to believe everything I'm telling you today because I'm a professor, right? That's right. No, don't. Don't. I'm trying to use arguments, I'm trying to use reason, I'm trying to use evidence. Just because a number of great scholars have believed in astrology, well, that ignores the fact that many, many more great scholars have not believed in astrology. But that alone isn't enough of a basis for belief. Argument from ignorance has a number of different forms, but here I can't think of why I see so many correspondences between astrological sign and personality, so astrology must be right. Because I can't think of any alternative explanation for why that appears to be so. Strength in numbers fallacy. So many people believe in it, so therefore there must be some validity to it.
argument for popularity?
Right. This has about a dozen different names.
61% don't believe it, so it's obviously.
Argumentum ad populum.
Strength in numbers fallacy.
Another way of.
Someone else answered it.
Oh, because you saw it on TV.
That's right. I read on the internet, so it must be true.
Well, that's the strength in media fallacy. Spurious similarity fallacy. So I mentioned this earlier. We're 90% water. Planets and stars affect water in known ways. Therefore, we're affected by planets and stars. Doesn't hold water. So some Greek guy looks at the stars 2,500 years ago and sees a ram. He believes this means something. I keep thinking of Richard Dreyfuss and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This means something. This means something. And that idea caught on. There wasn't any astronomy at the time, so it was not an unreasonable conjecture, actually, to make at the time. But as a result of that, today the sun rises in the Aries constellation when you're born, so you're going to have ram-like qualities. You're going to ram your ideas through committees at work, or a whole array of properties that go along with being an Aries. One problem that astrologers don't address is that the sun isn't actually rising in Aries anymore at that time of year. The whole precession of the equinox, the constellations have rotated by about 1/12, and now the sun is rising in Pisces on April 3rd. So you're really supposed to have Pisces fish qualities and go with the flow instead of ramming your ideas through the committee. And astrology has made no accommodations for that shift. Until very recently, a few years ago, they added a 13th sign, very controversial in astrology. Most don't buy it.
What is it?
Ophiuchus or
Does anyone know what it is?
Ophiuchus, the stakeholder, basically.
It's a what?
Yeah.
The wick is right.
Ophiuchus, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's like a stakeholder. You know,
Stakeholder.
someone holding a snake.
It doesn't solve the precession of the equinox problem.
How does that fix the precession?
Yeah. It was their response to it, I guess.
Now I thought there were individual astrologers, and that's one of the reasons there's such huge differences between what they predict based off their charts, is that some correct for it and some don't, because they can go off where it is now versus the standard charts,
Right.
and make predictions.
There's two phases. There's generating the chart, which is a mechanical process, and then there's doing the chart interpretation, which is totally open to subjective biases and individual interpretation. So another problem with scientific validity.
This is really critical to me. Am I an Aries or am I a Pisces?
I consider myself an Aries still. I don't know, but I try to go with the flow. All right, I'm going to wrap up here. So, is there any real connection? I was doing this in a kind of joking way between Christianity and astrology. On one level, no. I mean, there's a very different system of symbols, different methodologies, different consequences for the adherents. There were no astrological crusades that I'm aware of. So there are some, of course, real big differences between the two. But there are some similar functions, right? They do help us reduce stress of a certain kind, feel more secure in our lives and with our place in the world. They provide a focus of identity for a lot of people. I identify with other people who believe in astrology. We have news groups, we have websites, and so on. So you get a feeling of community from this, just as you would from a church community. And there is a lower level of belief in religious belief among astrology adherents, so that does seem to compensate somewhat for what other people are getting out of religion. And in some ways, I think they're identical. At a more abstract level, though, the psychological processes that are involved, the social processes that are involved, how we make judgments. We use rules of thumb, heuristics to make judgments about frequencies, about coincidences, about the meanings of things. As a result of using these rules of thumb, we tend to be biased in our beliefs, so we might be prone to subjective validation. Again, we only take the information that seems to fit and ignore the information that doesn't. We never believe in these things in a vacuum. There are always support groups for us, whether it's friends, family, clubs, and that's true for both. So it's not a simple question as to whether there's a connection between astrology and religion. I think in some ways there aren't, but in some important ways there really are. So what do I recommend? If it's important to you, check for a basis in reality. So be skeptical, ask questions, read and learn, and find out for yourself as opposed to just accepting what you're told. Embrace uncertainty. You have to allow for the possibility that everything isn't preordained, that your life isn't governed by these mysterious forces. Maybe there's an alternative way to look at all this. It's okay to not be sure. And be skeptical of what I tell you as well. And just the last image to think of, this is commitment, right here. She tattooed I don't know, I thought it was supposed to be Aries, but I don't see Aries, the constellation on her back. But I'm a little envious of having that kind of commitment to a belief system, but the evidence just doesn't seem to be there. And that's all I have. So. Yes.
I just think it's a very helpful parallelism to show astrology along with religion, to help understand how religion has no more basis than astrology.
Or at least that we may come to the same misconceptions about them.
That's a better way to say it.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things. There's an author who I think her real name is DM, I don't know what the DNM stands for, Murdoch, that has also gone by the pseudonym of Icaria S. And I don't know why, just the S is the surname thing. But anyway, she pushes this much stronger connection between astrology and Christianity, and it's almost like as bad as conspiracy theorism in how weak the connections are, but just because you can make so many of them that once you're motivated to look for them, that she does that, and some of it ended up in that Zeitgeist movie, or multiple versions of it. And the other thing is that my stepmom, who is heavily Southern Baptist, has occasionally sent me stuff trying to like convert me or whatever, reconvert, I don't know what she thinks. But one of them was a guy presenting the Star of Bethlehem as a conjunction of planets that rose in like Aries because that would be the lamb or something, and like set in Leo because it was a lion, and lion the lamb, and basically trying to use astrology to prove that the Star of Bethlehem was real.
Yeah.
It was like crazy as...
By connecting the dots again.
Yeah.
That metaphor really works for me. I do a little illustration for my students where I put 4 dots up on the screen, and I say, how would you connect those dots? Or what shape generated that pattern of dots? What underlying shape? And the obvious answer is a square. And then I just connect them with a circle. And it makes the point, right? I mean, when you have incomplete information about something and you're just using induction, you're just conjecturing, you can come up with pretty much anything. You can connect virtually anything to virtually anything else, especially if you're willing to ignore the things that don't fit. And like the fact that the Bible says astrology is bad.
Well,
It's incredible.
it says that to you they shall be for signs.
Okay, it's good.
So it also says to use them in,
Yeah.
you know, whatever.
I'm sure that's the only contradiction in there.
Oh, yeah.
We're on Pamphlet Bar today.
I've grown to believe that both astrology and religion are ways to try to understand the world, you know, and the unexplainable, the things that we feel so out of control about. It's a way of gaining some kind of control and understanding. And I know I went through my astrology period, and you know, it was my feeble attempt to try to make sense of what was going on in my life.
Sure.
And that is a result of external thinking. You know, I think it's rather than it's something outside of you.
Did you have help with that? Were you seeing an astrologer? Or?
I have seen astrologers.
Yeah. And astrologers have a customer satisfaction rating just as high as conventional therapists, too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it works, and it goes to show it may not be so much the content of what they're telling you, it's having a sympathetic ear,
Mm-hmm.
and they go way beyond what the astrological chart tells you. I mean, they give you advice. I mean, they say this is an interpretation of your chart, but still, they make it fit you and your needs, and yeah, it does provide a service. But for me, that's not a justification for it, right? I mean, it's not based
something I
on real.
believe in, yeah. Right.
I've wondered about religion and astrology as people groping for social status and credibility, especially with astrology, starting at a time when telling the king he's wrong could be called treason, punishable by death. So if you want to tell the king what he should be doing, you better have some backup, some kind of a theory. No, it isn't just me, it's the stars. You should not attack these people, at least not right now.
And that sounds so much more credible than entrails or tea leaves, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The cosmos are on my side. Yeah.
At risk of offending both halves of the gender divide here, my question is that the authority part of it, and this question about the king or whatever, God the Father, of course, it illustrates the question that male dominated, and then let's just say women being more grounded in reality and practical went along to get along, and that maybe they get buying into it just like anybody else would through all the means you've just explained. My view is that with the whole system we have in the 21st century is a derivative of that problem, and that essentially not thinking is just precipitated by not being allowed to think in certain groups, and one of them would be the paternalist model. And so priesthoods, Catholic, PhDs, etc.
I don't think that's going to offend anybody in this room.
No, I don't know, maybe.
There may be something to it.
Well, the idea that women go along to get along, I would just raise that issue.
Not matriarchal societies, but that's a whole other
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
That's a different lecture.
It's almost like more like the difference to power in general. I mean, I work at a place right now where male and female people buy into the fact that this is the best job in the world, and it stinks because they have no other options. So I think basically there's a difference in power going on, period.
Just a couple of comments. I have heard people who are into astrology say that if you don't fit your sign, you actually do, because every sign has the flip side.
Like what?
Every sign has a flip side.
The moon, like the moon sign and your sun sign?
No, my astrological sign is Scorpio, so that means I am dramatic, dark and mysterious, and vindictive.
You don't seem vindictive, but you seem darkly mysterious.
So I must be the flip side. And therefore that accounts for
Are you
that.
thinking
And the
about
other thing
So it
is,
explains everything or its opposite.
right. And the other thing is that even in a patriarchal society, there is that, there is a women's society which men know nothing about. They just don't tell you. So there's, women were, in Europe anyway, were the first doctors. They knew which herbs to use to ease childbirth.
And that's why they were
Hundreds, witches, etc. But for the most part, men just kind of didn't know about that. So you don't get told, sorry.
Was there, did you have that?
No, I mean, just, it's so similar to religion in that if you want to believe it, it's so easy to create explanations why maybe something doesn't really fit in. Like, oh, today's supposed to be a good day for me to do this according to my chart, but this didn't work out. It's really easy to find a way to understand.
What gets me going about it, though, is religion doesn't generally go around saying we're scientific, except for those small, and believe me, go after the creationists and intelligent design theorists. But astrology as a whole really seems to believe it's a science and tries to legitimate itself on that basis to the public. And that's just wrong. That's wrong.
There's some things about around like conspiracy theorism, where somebody believing in one is more likely to believe in others, even when the claims of them would conflict, like saying that so-and-so, like Bin Laden has been dead since 2000, or Bin Laden, is still alive, and they'd like accept both of them, even though it's obviously impossible. But
let's go for Tyrese Glass.
I don't know what you're saying, sorry. But that being open to, I think maybe it's broader, that being open to one magical thinking system would make you just prone to being open to other magical thinking systems, even when they conflict, like astrology and Christianity may conflict, and that also having an external locus of control, thinking that everything around you is what's causing problems or good things in your life, except in not your own actions, also makes you more prone to buying into those magical thinking systems.
Yeah, you're right.
So, I don't know. I mean, I can see how the religious idea that this whole world was created for us humans, and there's this big being that wants a personal relationship, and the entire cosmos is telling or influencing your life. Both of those things make you much bigger than you really are.
Yes.
I was just going to say that my brother has a severe mental illness, and it's quite sad, but his entire life is outside of himself. The FBI and CIA are reading his feet, and and he's a Christian, and so he's been saved, so he can say and do anything he wants. I mean, just all these things. I don't know where he stands on astrology. It's probably part of the
I don't want to
Antichrist
mention
theory.
astrology.
Yeah, no. You know, it's an example of someone that's in the extreme that is so externalized that he can take no responsibility for anything.
Yeah, there's a continuum, the locus of control continuum that psychologists talk about.
Yeah.
It's a personality. Characteristics. Some feel very efficacious and they're running the show, and others feel completely pushed and pulled by all the forces.
Like your brain.
Including, you know, where the solitude.
You know, a lot of it seems to come down to a basic psychology that we've been duking it out with since the Greeks. You have basically Democritus saying the world is a material construct, and you have Plato and his gang saying, no, we have this perfect sphere of activity, it's all mental. And when people buy into the noise in their head at a wide variety of levels, and it's still going on. It's like, you know, my construct in here trumps the reality out here, whether it's going to be scientific or not scientific. And that's the big thing. It's like breaking out of the prison of our minds.
Do we need to?
No, I was going to say, if you don't mind, I was just going to let you eat.
Maybe you should talk amongst yourselves.
One last point, the NIH is headed up by a man who explains to us how irrational it is not to believe if you are a thinking person, because we don't know. There isn't an X out there, male or female, of course. You might take a vote. What it would be.
It's like scientific logic fallacies.
Right, and he's ahead of the NIH.
Well, if we can give him another round of applause. Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun, and so I think this is going to lead to some awesome discussion this morning. So please, eat now. Now that you've got to watch us eat.